Last week, the Supreme Court made several decisions which could come up to be some of the most consequential decisions of our time. The first of which takes a look at presidential immunity and could actually be the key to handling the Donald Trump cases. Another handles Chevron Deference. Is the expert economy over, and will the legislature be legislating again? All that and more. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the Jeremy Ryan Slate Show. I am your host, Jeremy Ryan Slate, the CEO and co-founder of Command Your Brand. We help our clients to combat cancel culture by placing them on the right podcasts and new media. You can check us out over at commandyourbrand.com. Reminder, if you are brand new to this channel, to like this video, leave us a comment, and smash that subscribe button if you support liberty, freedom, and want to build a better future. And guys, I'm very interested to dive into the legal aspects of things today. So we have a really, really good guest I've followed for a number of years now for a lot of his opinions on what used to be known as Twitter and now it's known as X. So Ron Coleman, welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you very much. Good to see you. Nice to meet you in person, Jeremy.
Absolutely. You're in Jersey too, is that correct?
I am. What do you mean too? I didn't know that you were in Jersey.
I am in Northwest, man. It's all farms out here, so.
Yeah, well, that's actually, I'm always reminding people that once you get out of this, the 973 cluster, New Jersey is pretty red.
Yeah.
You got to watch out around Princeton and Trenton, Mercer County, for obvious reasons.
Well, they redistricted us pretty bad because, I'm in Sussex County on the border of Warren, and we used to be E. Scott Garrett's congressional district for a long time, and then they did this whole redistricting and pulled us into higher population areas and stuff. They've done some funky stuff here, man.
Well, that will happen.
So, Ron, for people that may not be familiar with you and what you do, tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do, sir.
Well, I am a lawyer. I'm counsel now in the Dillon Law Group. I was a partner until January of this year. I do commercial litigation. My focus historically, and when you're as old as I am, it is pretty much historical, although I know that you've studied Roman history, so you're not as impressed with 30 years of 35 years of law practice. But I've done a lot of work in trademarks, unfair competition, defamation, and free speech. I have a podcast. It's called Culmination. And I am on X, as you say. I spent a lot of time on X trying to correct everyone who's wrong on the internet, which, as you can imagine, is quite a lift.
Well, I think it's really important though, because I think one of the number one things on X is yes, information travels fast, and that's definitely good. But I think at the same time, there's a very loose understanding of the legalities of things, and I think that's very important to understand to have a good hold on our world today.
100%. I mean, at this point, our family and everyone around us relies on social media for news. I mean, none of the traditional news media are reliable, even for what you would think of as the most routine local stuff. But everything has become so politicized and ideological that there is a bit of a danger of the silo effect happening, in any social environment, and it happens on X also. But you do find out what both sides are saying ultimately, and you really do get an opportunity to get relatively unvarnished news. That doesn't mean it's always correct.
Sure,
but you do develop a little bit of a nose for what shouldn't be taken at face value, and who tends to be a little bit over the top. It's a pretty good system.
So we've had some very important Supreme Court decisions recently, and I wanted to dive into some of those. And looking at it, the first one is the presidential immunity one, because I think, to me, I had a whole lot of questions on this once again, because I have a very loose, though my brother-in-law is a lawyer, I have a very loose understanding of the legal system. And I guess number one, if you want to talk about the decision as it relates to Trump and what it means, and then I kind of have some questions about where this takes us. So if you could just kind of explain the decision and what it means for us at the moment.
Sure, Jeremy. So, the question before the Supreme Court was whether the president has immunity from criminal prosecution for acts carried out while in office. He was charged in the case that ended up before the Supreme Court in the District of D.C. with five things. He made public statements about the administration of a federal election, which, believe it or not, is being treated like a criminal offense. He communicated as president with senior Justice Department officials about investigating election fraud. He communicated with state officials about federal election and supervision of federal elections in those states. He communicated with the vice president about their official duties, and obviously he tried to convince Pence not to certify the election until court challenges had been played out. And he was involved in the so-called fake electors or alternative electors scheme.
Which I will point out, just so people historically know, like the Democratic Party has done that before. Like I think Hawaii is the one that's cited most often in the Nixon election, was it? So yeah.
Yes, the Democrats do it every time, in fact. But what they've never done, and this is an important point to keep in mind, what they've never done is either described it as a crime or much less prosecuted anyone for it as if it were a crime, and certainly not prosecuted a president of the United States for any involvement in it. So there are a number of precedents. But the question was, can you prosecute the president for conduct that he has undertaken during the time he was president? So we have a few a few precedents before us. 1959, Barr versus Mateo, the court said that there is immunity for executive officials performing discretionary functions. Absolute privilege to government officials who are doing their job as they're supposed to be doing it. 1978, Stump versus Sparkman, judicial immunity for judges. So no judge ever has to worry about being prosecuted for anything he or she does in a judgy way. Mm-hmm. Fitzgerald versus Nixon, former president has absolute immunity from damages liability. This is for civil liability for acts taken not only in core constitutional presidential duties, but basically anything he's doing that is not really personal, what they call the outer perimeter. What had never been in front of the court was whether or not there was immunity for official acts under the criminal laws. So the Trump team went in, and I should just make it clear for viewers that my firm and I do represent the Trump campaign. I'm not speaking on their behalf. I'm not speaking on my firm's behalf. And I'm not speaking on behalf, and we do not represent Donald Trump personally. And certainly, and we're not involved in the criminal cases either. But the Trump legal team, our colleagues, took the position that former presidents have absolute immunity for actions taken within the scope of their official duties. And the government said, no, not if it's criminal. And the Supreme Court said, no, that's really not workable. Official acts, they said, if it's an official action, the president is presidenting, it's immune, presumptively immune. If it's an official action, but not exclusively within the president's power, it may be immune unless it interferes with the president's job. Unofficial acts, personal stuff that the president does, that even though he's president, and even if it has to do with being president in the sense of running for president, no immunity. So it turns out that, for example, the so-called fraudulent electors claim was not, the Trump team actually acknowledged that there was no claim, there was no defense claimed based on immunity there. That was a personal act. He was running for president. It was purely electoral. The Justice Department, whatever the president tells the Justice Department to do, he's immune for, because running the Justice Department is his job. We don't look to the motivation of the president. This is a very important outcome of this case. We don't ask ourselves what was his purpose. There's no way for a president to do his job if every time he does something, even if it's well within the constitutional scope of his job, he is second guessed as to why he did it. So the Supreme Court said, we're not going there. It's absolute immunity. Speaking to the vice president, presumptive immunity. The government could come forward with facts demonstrating that he wasn't doing it for an official reason. He was doing it for a personal reason, but presumptively the president is immune.
And that would be like, if you look at it through his association with the Justice Department, correct? Like is that correct?
I think it's going to be very hard to overcome that burden. I think the making false claims of election fraud. I mean, first of all, it's absolutely preposterous to suggest that could be illegal.
Right.
But the claim that he tried to pressure state legislatures and election officials about electoral votes, also presumably official. There's constitutional basis for the president to be involved in that. If they could prove that it was not official, but it was personal, it's a little bit vague there.
Sure.
And the Capitol attack, an open fact question, because we don't really know what he was doing. We know that the facts, the real facts, as opposed to the phony facts.
Right.
The January 6th committee facts are the phony facts. The real facts are that Trump told people to peaceably assemble and to respect the police. So the Supreme Court didn't get into those weeds. In fact, one important point the Supreme Court made was, hey, district court judge, you kind of decided this rather quickly. Considering what a gigantic issue this is in terms of our constitutional order and in terms of our political system, you should have had a hearing. You should have briefed all the issues. Instead, you just kind of waved your hands at it. We're sending this back to you to take a good look at it and develop a record. And if we have to second guess, or rather, if we have to review your decisions based on the factual record, then we can do that. But as of right now, we're sending it back to you. So that's where things stand.
So, and I think that the point I really want to make, because I think there's a real importance to this that I don't think everyone gets. And when you look at, just I guess going back to kind of my field of study, if you look at the late Roman Republic, why does it fall? Because someone serves as consul and then they pass laws, or they go prosecute them for crimes that may or may not have been crimes or imagined crimes, or they were all equally guilty of after someone's term. And I think often we're told the story of Julius Caesar differently than what actually happened, right? Like his enemies kept pushing him, and eventually he said, okay, guys, I'll call your bluff. And that creates a situation where that is how a republic falls. So I think this is an important decision from that aspect, that the rule of law holds. But I guess looking at it now, we have these different court decisions out there. We have Alvin Bragg just moved the decision in New York City to, it was like September 18th or something like that. So how does this relate now to these cases? And do you think this could cause anything moving forward?
Well, it is remarkable what a screw up that New York case is turning out to be for the Bragg mob, because.
Well, and even after Michael Cohen's testimony, I don't know how they even kept going. It just seems strange to me.
Well, it is strange. I mean, it is a well-established fact that this was an utterly preposterous proceeding from go through the jury deliberations. What we have now learned is that, well, we haven't learned. We saw it at the time that
Sure.
The judge allowed evidence in based on conduct. The judge in the New York State case, based on conduct by Trump, which under Supreme Court law, we now know is established to have been non-prosecutable. In other words, he could not be convicted for it because the offenses against because the charges against Trump were premised in part on that conduct being illegal. It has unquestionably tainted the entire verdict. I mean, the verdict was already rather tainted, but
there's a felony in there somewhere, so we're going to charge these misdemeanors in hopes to eventually find the felony as a felony, and that's a bit of legal mumbo jumbo, man.
That's the mumbo jumbo, but what is impressive is that the judge, is as awful as he is, acknowledged that he can't go forward with the sentencing. You'd think, considering that he has ignored every other defect with this proceeding until now, that he would just go full speed ahead. But I saw people who know these things, or people who speculate about these things, are under the impression that he must have gotten the memo, that since he's been a political operative all along. I mean, I tend to be very skeptical of that stuff. What I'm always telling people, and this goes for both conservative judges and liberal judges,
sure,
is that the vast majority of them are not corrupt. They're not compromised in the sense of they are taking orders or they've been bribed. This is who they are. This is who they are, and they're proud of it. And I think that's the case here as well.
And now, a word from our sponsors.
The Wellness Company and their doctors are medical professionals you can trust. And their new medical emergency kits are the gold standard when it comes to keeping you safe and healthy. This medical emergency kit contains an assortment of life-saving medications, including ivermectin, Z-Pak. Rest assured, knowing that you have emergency antibiotics, antivirals, and antiparasitics on hand to help you and your family stay safe from whatever life throws at you next.
So you can support the Wellness Company by heading over to twc.health/JRS. That is twc.health/JRS. Get up to 15% off select products. Support the Wellness Company and help support this show. Thanks again. I guess the question I would have is, moving the sentencing, what does that make time for? What happens in the meantime? And can a verdict be vacated? Can it be overturned? Like, I guess, what does this have to do with any of that?
So what the judge did was invited the parties to submit briefs arguing exactly what the answers to those questions should be. How does the Trump immunity decision affect this verdict? Do we need to do a retrial? Do we need do we need to reduce some charges but not all the charges? I mean, look, you're talking about a case that was going to be reversed on appeal no matter what. People find that hard to believe, but and as someone who's dealt with the first judicial department, which is the appellate court that would be considering this in New York, I understand why they find it hard to believe, because that is a very unsatisfactory panel. It tends to be very political, and be that as it may, this is an embarrassment to everyone involved in the New York judiciary. And it is possible that the Supreme Court opinion gets them out of this. They might actually be able to just say, well, we tried to do the right thing, but those fascists in the Supreme Court stopped us from doing so. And guess that dangerous Donald Trump is going to walk.
Which I think is funny because, you even look at Amy Coney Barrett, like, often sides with the liberals now. So, like, I don't know how they can make the claims they can make. So it's kind of shocking to me. Are you going to say something, Ron?
Don't be shocked.
Well, yeah, Notre Dame. But I guess looking at it then, does this have an effect on a case like Steve Bannon's or something like that? Or is that kind of too far outside the periphery? The reason I ask, and this is just because the thinking I had on it, and once again, you know more of the legal side of it, so correct me if I make any missteps here. But basically, Bannon was claiming presidential immunity for the January 6th committee because it was related between conversations with himself and President Trump. Trump later waived that, but that was too far after the timeline that the January 6th committee wanted. So they're kind of saying you're sending to jail anyway. Now, does this mean that he does actually have immunity, or does this have nothing to do with it?
That's a great question. I would say that it seems likely that we'll be seeing some kind of filing by the Bannon team soon on exactly that question. I mean,
okay.
What they did to him is absolutely blood-curdling.
Well, I do want to, because I know I don't have a ton of your time, Ron, I want to also get into Chevron deference too, because I think like the January 6th case, like there's definitely a lot to it, but I think Chevron to me is even bigger because it changes the way our system functions. And if people haven't heard it, there's a really good podcast series that Glenn Beck's doing on Saturday mornings, where he basically takes a look at the progressive era, which I think is one of the most biggest travesties to happen to America, because we kind of lose functional republic things. But there's basically experts that, like the EPA and these different segments that start being running things rather than congressional laws. So if you want to explain like what Chevron deference means and kind of how it sits with things, and then I want to take a look at like, does this actually change anything?
Chevron is the name of an oil company, as we all know. Why is it called Chevron deference? Most companies don't get laws named after them. So Chevron challenged the authority of the Environmental Protection Agency, to regulate certain conduct in which affected Chevron's ability to do what Chevron does, which is pump oil out of the ground and sell it to us. And the Supreme Court held, in a silly way, that the question of whether or not the EPA has authority over an area of regulation is up to the EPA. And the same thing with any other any other congressionally created agency. That the agency, those guys are the experts. Congress uses broad terminology, and we have to rely on the experts to tell us whether or not the authority granted by Congress should extend to the area of regulation. And it is virtually impossible to overcome that burden of deference to the agency. This has been, and entire careers have been spent on people who do administrative law, working within that framework. It is a very agency-friendly, government-friendly, market-hostile framework, because it gives agencies which are staffed by people who are experts. And I think if we didn't know what a slippery concept experts were or is until 5 years ago, well, we know now.
Yeah. Anthony Fauci all taught us that very well, right?
Right. All the so-called experts are all, and it just goes across the entire society in every field. Experts are just people like us with their own motivations and their own, differing levels of trustworthiness. So the Supreme Court, it's been understood among lawyers for a very long time that Chevron deference was a mistake, because agencies are not in the business of saying we don't regulate that. They're in the business of saying we do regulate that, because that means more work, more power for me, more staffing, more resources, more prestige, and more opportunities when I go into the private sector and then consult with you guys that I'm regulating about how to avoid being victimized by people like me, who are now my successors. Supreme Court said, no, that's not going to do. Congress has to do it. Congress has to write laws in a way that make it clear what the scope of regulation is. And if there's a question about what Congress meant, answering that question is a judicial task, not an agency task. It is not reading legislation. When it comes to reading legislation, we're the experts. You come to us, and we'll hear testimony from the agency. We'll listen to their expert opinion about what Congress probably meant and why, as an expert on field X or Y, it makes sense for. That's something that a court can consider. But to leave it up to the agency itself to make that determination turned out to be a mistake. There has to be more accountability.
So I guess the question I would have then is, what effect does this cause moving forward? Like, I can see how it causes like a future effect of like future regulations, but what happens to all the regulations that already exist? Like, are we going to be, spending years in court trying to sort out like what exists and what doesn't exist and what's a law and what isn't a law? Or like, how does that work?
Yeah, well, there are going to be a lot of challenges because even though there are regulations that are in place that are now going to be challenged, and there isn't going to be retroactive relief. In other words, the government isn't going to say sorry, and a court's not going to say, listen, the government should not have regulated, prohibited you from drilling a well here.
Sure.
Sorry,
but can those things get reviewed? Like, could somebody go back and review something in past tense?
What they can't say is this was never a proper subject of regulation.
Okay.
And we are seeking an order rolling back those regulations and validating them going forward. So that's one effect that's going to have on regulation itself.
That seems like it could overwhelm the legal system.
That is going to be a very big deal. It's going to cause some havoc. Probably not as much as people think because the sky's always falling.
Sure.
But there's also another effect that a very fine young lawyer named Danny Ahn pointed out in a discussion that I was part of online on Friday, which is that one of the things that these agencies do is direct massive amounts of money to NGOs as part of settlements. They take private money and they use it to fund almost overwhelmingly left-wing political organizations.
So does that shut the fire hose off then?
That is going to have a profound effect on the fire hose.
Wow.
Pretty good.
That's remarkably interesting because like if you look at it, that's how the government gets undermined, right? So it's actually a big deal for reestablishing Congress as a real legislative body.
Which would be a great idea because they don't really do anything in the legislative business anymore. They do a lot of crap, a lot of posing, a lot of virtue signaling, but there are so many areas of legislation that need reform or being, we have courts interpreting statutes that are generations old to see how they apply to AI and the internet and mobile communications and the worlds that don't exist anymore were the framework for statutes that are still in place. If Congress can actually get back to work, this will incentivize them to do so.
Well, and I think the important thing about that is if you look at there's been a lot of talk, you mentioned about AI, there's been a lot of talk about cryptocurrencies and things like that too. And the Biden administration last year, and I think at some point this year, announced their regulatory plan for that. And I guess the question I would have is, does this in a lot of ways bring it back to the people? Because there should be a congressional process to pass that law where somebody would get to have input, you get to have say something about it, there would be hearings.
Yeah,
so is that
really
what we get back to?
The irony is that the left-wingers on social media who are blowing a gasket, the lack of self-awareness it would be mind-boggling if we hadn't already just seen it for so long now. But how can unelected judges with life terms make these decisions, take them away from experts? So, first of all, your whole premise about experts, as we said at the very beginning, is garbage. Second of all, what the court said was not we, the judges, will decide, but rather Congress will decide. If Congress fails to decide, then we, the judges, will either say Congress didn't decide and it has to decide, and until it does, we have no, prima facie, there's no regulation. Congress can make a decision. It always comes back to Congress. In fact, Congress could even, to some extent, change the law under Chevron Deference. Not the constitutional aspect to it, but they certainly there are things that Congress could do that would strengthen the hands of agencies if there's a desire to do that. I don't think there is.
So I guess moving forward then, like how because it to me, it seems like, yes, the Supreme Court is often deciding on things when they had their sessions throughout the year. But like, to me, this seems like several very consequential rulings. And I guess, where do you think this puts us kind of moving forward on the rulings we're getting?
We're going to see a lot of money moving into lobbying. Mm-hmm. That, there's already a lot of money in lobbying, but also a lot of effort to monitor it in a way that, I think it is laudable. We should know who's spending money on what in Congress. And there's going to have to be a level of accountability. It's not going to do any more for Congress to pass laws regulating important components of the economy and use broad sweeping language that sounds very good in press releases. They're going to have to get down to the nitty gritty. Now, there is an argument that if you take this power away from agency experts, you end up giving it to congressional staff experts who suffer from some of the same problems. There's a very strong inclination towards corruption. The whole political horse trading, a lot of the same things, but at least congressional staff experts, again, you can go to a congressman whom you elect and say, this is what your legislative aide, you're a member of the Agricultural Committee. Here's the latest bill that you co-sponsored. Who wrote this? And they have to answer. Agencies don't have to answer. They're not accountable.
I think the difficulty in that too, because this could be a whole nother conversation, is like, there needs to be not just like term limits for members of Congress, but their staff is the bigger problem, because they go from left, Democrat to Republican or independent, and they go back and forth. And like, to me, you get kind of the person you elect just being the face, but the people behind them are the ones doing everything, because your member of Congress is probably too busy raising money because the RNC has a certain amount of money on their head they're supposed to raise every year. So it becomes a bit messy.
Yeah, it's a problem. The professional legislative class. I mean, if I were to wake up in a bad dream and find myself if I were to have a bad dream, find myself in Congress next January, first thing I would do would be to look for experienced staff members. Maybe some of my Republican colleagues would donate or recommend junior people to fill out my staff office. And I'm going to rely on them, kind of the way Donald Trump relied on DC professionals when he came into office and got absolutely snookered by basically the deep state, which is a uniparty phenomenon. So yeah, that is a problem. But again, it was a problem under the agency system also. So at least there is some. I mean, look, we need to reform a lot of stuff. And you know what else, Jeremy? We need a lot less law.
Yeah.
And if what this means is that Congress slows down the process of regulation and maybe even rolls back some of its own regulation because it now becomes accountable for some of the ridiculous stuff that it's been doing, that's good.
Absolutely. Well, Ron, I really enjoyed having you on today and really explaining these things and kind of where they fit, because I think this is a very, very consequential situation. I think for most people, it's not even registering on their radar. So I think it's important we discuss it. So for people watching, how can they connect with you, follow you, support you?
Best way to find me is to go to X and search for Ron Coleman, Coleman, Ron Coleman. If you search for me on the internet, you'll find me also, but put in the word lawyer or else you're going to get a bodybuilder who is not me. He's a fine person, but he is not me. I have a YouTube channel. I have the Ron Coleman, the Culmination podcast. And I love talking to people about legal issues. And if people have a legal issue that maybe would involve hiring a lawyer, talk to me. If I'm not the right lawyer, I'll find you one who is.
Cool. And guys, after you've spent many days consuming Ron's content, do go Google the other Ron Coleman. Google his name and peanut. You'll get a great video that goes, ain't nothing but a peanut. Lightweight. Yeah, buddy. Anyway, Ron Coleman, thanks for hanging out with me today. And for those of you guys watching, a reminder to like this video, leave us a comment, and smash that subscribe button. You support liberty, freedom, and want to build a better future. I'll catch you guys next time.